everyone to the Park Street University stage at BarCon at Berlin. I'm Stephanie, your stage moderator, and thank you so much for being here for this seminar on the contemporary whiskey shelf. For those unfamiliar, Park Street is an importer, exporter, distributor, and back office provider for wines and spirits brands across the globe. We work with thousands of entrepreneurs to help scale and grow their businesses, and we run this stage and Park Street University because we believe in the power of education and that the more resources and information emerging brands have, the better their chances are for longevity. During this seminar, each presenter has roughly 10 or so minutes to present on their given topic within our session topic, and then we'll bring them all back on stage to give you the chance to ask any follow-up questions. Don't worry about taking pictures of the slides. We will be recording the sessions and will happily provide replay footage as well as the presentations after the show. You'll see a number of QR codes around the room. You could sign up to receive the replays through those. So this seminar is all about a look at the contemporary whiskey shelf, specifically about examining the regions and trends shaping the world's whiskey segment and influencing consumer preferences. Here with me today are F.Leoni, co-founder and COO of The Heart Cut, which is an independent bottler that spotlights whiskey distilleries across the world. He'll be discussing how whiskey brands appeal to today's consumers. We also have R.Caldwell, Global Brand Ambassador of Teeling Whiskey. With over 20 years of bartending and whiskey experience, he has earned the title the world's best Irish whiskey ambassador at the World Whiskey Awards, and he'll be discussing brand positioning in the whiskey category. We also have S.Barlow, expert manager of Hoteling & Co., with years of sales experience and progressive leadership roles. She now focuses on international expansion and bringing spirits to consumers around the world. She'll be discussing the rapidly evolving modern whiskey market. And without further ado, please enjoy.
Lovely. Well, first and foremost, thank you everyone for coming down. I'll skip through this purely because I am wearing the same top as in that picture. The picture happened a minute ago, it's fine. But we'll get straight on to a little bit about me. So, as just mentioned, I am the co-founder of an independent bottling company called The Heart Cut. And as we've said, we spotlight distilleries from around the world through single casks and small batch bottlings. We'll get onto that in just a moment, but just a little bit about me and my background and where I've come from. As with many 18-year-olds, I kind of had the decision, do I go to uni, do I do a gap year? Took the gap year route, decided to get a bar job. Little did I know that that bar job would end up changing my life, and I'd end up being at BCB doing a presentation on something that I know and love. But through that bar career, I worked 4 years in different bars and different cocktail bars in London before transitioning into the marketing world, and in particular working in drinks marketing with the likes of the Diageos, the Bacardis, etc., etc. And through that career in the next 6 years of working in different marketing companies, I got to work with everyone imaginable. If you think the distillers, the brand owners, the sales teams, the brand ambassadors, all the way through to the end consumer. And so that gave me this real holistic view of what are brands doing today, what is working, what could be the next big thing. And I can't take too much credit because my co-founder and awesome wife has worked in the whiskey industry for 15 years. And so our passion for this industry has really kind of led us to creating The Heart Cut. Less on a work perspective, we are foodies, we are drinks enthusiasts. We travel the world purely based on what we want to eat and where we want to drink. And we are those people that our friends come to and go, hey Fab, where should I go? I'm going to New York, what bar should I go to? And so we've always had these lists ready to go out. The Heart Cut is that combination. Instead of us telling people what bars to go to, we are finding distilleries that we know and love all over the world and introducing them to people that might not otherwise come across S.Barlow Distillery in Mexico. They might not come across Stanley Distillery in Denmark. So, whiskey is growing. It worked out to be a really fantastic time to launch a whiskey company, but the players are changing. So it's not just the big five. If you think the Japan, the Americas, Scotland, Canada, and Ireland being the big five, World whiskey has become a thing. World whiskey is growing. And you might recognize some of the brands behind me, you might not, but that's the beautiful thing. So these distilleries, they're not just being noticed by the trade, by people at BCB, they have stands here, they're being noticed by probably the most important person, and that is this new whiskey consumer. Now when I talk about this new whiskey consumer, I like to break it down into the whiskey enthusiast, you know, the person who loves single cask, the person that drinks a lot of whiskey, they understand the technicalities when it comes to whiskey. The people that we know and love as people in the whiskey industry because they're going to buy our products. But then we have the whiskey curious. These are the people who are embarking on this journey. They like to buy coffee from their specialist coffee shop. They travel the world to go and eat certain particular styles of food. They are the people that will spend that little bit more money on something that they love because they can justify it. This is this audience, the person who will drink less but better, this affluent, knowledgeable person. And these are the people who are starting to buy into what it is. But what do they want? They want a brand that builds community. People, we're social beings, we're social creatures, we like to belong. The Nike Run Club is a fantastic example of creating a community around not Nike as a brand, but the activity. And if you think of the millions of whiskey clubs across the world, that is a perfect example. And so brands can do exactly the same. They can build this community around them. Newness and variety. People today don't want to drink what their parents drank, what their grandparents drank. They want something new, they want something exciting. Guidance from a credible and trusted voice. How many times have you been onto a website and gone, the first thing is you check the reviews, you look at who the owner is, you want to see if they're a whiskey company, do they have the right to be standing up there talking to you and selling you their wares? A captivating brand story. You know, this is the thing that makes someone smile. This is the one thing that there are lots of brands out there. There are lots of brands here at BCB, but what is that one brand that's going to stick with you for the rest of time? That's what people want to buy into. They love these stories. And then finally, ease and simplicity. Life is hard. You know, you talk to everyone, how you doing? I'm busy. Brands that can make it work for people, brands that can make it easy. How can they make their consumer's journey that more profitable? You know, they will come back to you time and time and time again if they can get what they want and if they can get it quickly. But that's not the only thing. If you think about how consumer purchasing is starting to change, this is where it gets really exciting, because digital discovery is that thing. How can we embrace your brand? How can we work with your brand? And social media is this beautiful place that allows you to educate, inspire, and excite someone. And so that's how people are starting to buy through social media and through digital discovery. Self-expression is another beautiful place of how it all starts to come to life. When someone takes a bottle round to someone's house, they're not just saying, here's a bottle of whiskey, here's a bottle of wine, here is a bottle that represents me. They want to pick up something that is self-reflective of who they are as a person. You know, I've even got to the point where I'm taking bottles of olive oil round to a friend's house because it's something new, it's something cool. You want that social currency to be able to go, hey, you've never seen this before, but I have. Let me tell you this really interesting story. The one-click buy, Amazon, everybody says they're never going to buy from it, yet everyone still does. How can people want something? They want it straight away. There's been so many times when I've been in the purchasing queue of trying to get something, it becomes too difficult, and then I stop. That's what people want nowadays. And then research. People will research until the nth degree. They will Google what's the best bourbon, what's the best rye, what's the best single malts. This is just how people are starting to buy things. But how are whiskey brands starting to appeal to this audience? First and foremost, design. Something, if you walk into a whiskey shop, into a whiskey bar, there is a lot of options. And so how are you going to differentiate yourself? What is that one thing that you can do? And that is the bottle design, that is the label design. These are two of my latest releases, a little self-promo out there, but it's having a little bit of fun. How can you inject what your brand is into it? How can you distill your DNA into a label, into a bottle design to excite someone? You know, this is not new. This has been happening in wine, in craft beer. So it's how do you use design to your advantage? Do you put a QR code on your label to really give people that extra information? How can you stand out? Language. For anyone who doesn't know, that is my wonderful wife there in the middle and business partner. But it's removing the jargon. You know, people don't want to know all of the ins and outs of every different types of whiskey. It can become bamboozling. There's already enough
difficulty going on, talk to people like they're people. You know, really break it down in a way that you would want to be spoken to. The way I like to see it is leaving that marketing jargon elsewhere. Marketing just stays internal presentations, have some fun, talk to people the way you want to be spoken to. Possibly the most important, I'd say most definitely the important, is this pursuit of flavour. The world knows whiskey in a certain guise. It's the Scotch, the Irish, and this is what whiskey has been. We're starting to see something different. We're really pushing the realms of what whiskey can be. There are so many different distilleries here that we'll point out in just a moment, all over BCB, that I recommend to go and try, because you try it and you go, well, that's not whiskey, and it's like, well, it's not whiskey how we put it into our little box. This box is growing and it is so much bigger than anything we could possibly do. So this pursuit of flavour through different cask types, through different yeast strains, playing around, transferring barrels from one climate to another, and really just trying to understand what would happen if I was to do something ever so slightly differently. And then the glue that brings it all together, what is that story? People buy into stories. We are beyond the world of just having a brand. This picture it represents one of my favourite distilleries actually, and it's Kiuru, who are based in Finland. And it's a story that I'll remember forever and ever, because Finland, 5 million people, 2.2 million saunas, quite a lot of saunas per person. And then one of their national dishes is rye bread. And so what happens when you have a group of friends sitting in a sauna drinking American rye whiskey going, well, why can't we do our own rye whiskey, considering we have so much rye here in Finland? That is how Kiuru was born. Those guys went and created a distillery. And this is how the power of stories, how can you take what you have done and how can you build around it and then create a brand and make sure that the liquid stacks up in the design and you're creating these fantastic brand stories. And so just to round it out, we have the Heartcuts one to watch, and some, as we mentioned, we're an independent bottler. We've been around for just over a year, but we've had this opportunity to work with so many amazing distilleries, and we're starting to notice these varying trends. And the first being American single malt. Now, when I say single malt, most people assume Scotch. If you remove the geography from this, all of a sudden there is this wonderful opportunity of flavour, of passion that's going to start coming through. Ourselves at the Heartcut have bottled a Danish single malt, an Israeli single malt, and we've also had the pleasure of working with Westwood to create our own single malt with them, an American single malt. And this has really started to grow in importance. In 2016, Westwood, alongside some other distilleries, they joined together to create the American Whiskey Committee, and that's all about putting guidelines in place for what American whiskey should be, but more importantly, what it shouldn't be. So they've leaned heavily into the guidelines that dictate a rye and a bourbon, and they really just want to have they want to put the rules down, because that gives the credibility. We've spoken about it, and by having this credibility, it allows other people to join in and build on this category. In the last 4 or 5 years, in a global perspective, American single malts have grown by 34%, which is quite an astounding number, which arguably bourbon is still a lot bigger, but it trumps the growth rate of bourbon on a global scale. So it is taking off, and the fact that Jack Daniels are releasing their own single malt is only testament to the fact that American single malt is here and it's only going to grow. Craft Japanese whiskey. Now this is where it gets really exciting. 10 years ago, you'd think Suntory, you'd think Nikka when it comes to Japanese whiskey. Nowadays, there are over 70 whiskey distilleries in Japan, which is mind-boggling to even start to comprehend. But what we want to really focus here are 2 things. First being regionality. So Japan, for anyone who has an idea of the geography, is an extremely long country. In the north, Arctic conditions, it's snow heavy, and in the bottom it's the tropics. And so if you think about that in terms of whiskey maturation and the various different possibilities of what a distillery in the north is going to be able to produce versus the south, in the coming years we can only imagine to see that Japanese whiskey is not just going to be Japanese whiskey, but they're really going to start to dive down into what part of Japan, therefore what flavours are you going to start to see coming out. The second being the craft angle. Konosuke is a really great example of this style of craft distillery. So we have a 4th generation shochu family who are paying respects to their elders, but they're going, well, you're doing things this way, I want to put my own stamp. And so they're able to kind of weave in innovation and doing things ever so slightly differently to kind of, in a craft manner, put their stamp on what they think Japanese whiskey should be. So in terms of craft and originality, they're really starting to take hold. The rise of Nordic whiskey. Again, about 43 different distilleries operating across the Nordic region, which is crazy to see. Like, our first distillery that we launched with was astounding in themselves. But the real opportunity here is that they have started to tie into what that food culture is. Everyone can kind of understand the nomas and how the Nordics have taken that cuisine. The distilleries have done something similar. They're working with their local environment. They're really trying to break it down and have some fun. And how can they distinguish themselves, as I mentioned before, in Finland with Kira using rye, or just different styles of whiskey. And they're really starting to push what can be done differently. Stouning is a great example of, out of the 9 founders, 4 of them are engineers. And so every time they went through the process of, I'm creating whiskey, if X is meant to give us something and taste like Scotch, I'm going to go in the complete opposite direction. So they're taking the foundations of Scotch and what these other great whiskey producing nations are doing, but they're doing it in their own way. They really want to represent, this is who we are and this is how it is reflective of our countries. And then just to finish up, and this really again tiles down into locality. So the locality of smoke, and I've found a little prop on my way over today, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that is. But especially myself, for a lot of my bartending career into whiskey, when people say smoke, you automatically think Islay. And if you were to break it down and go, well, people use a fuel source to dry their barley. And so what hundreds of years ago you would use a fuel source that is closely readily available to you. Once upon a time you couldn't just ship something, you couldn't fly it in, you couldn't put it on a train. And so local areas were using the heat source that was available to them. On Islay, it was a peat that kind of boiled down for years and years and years in the seaweed-esque. On mainland Scotland, it's more of a heather style of peat. But then if you move over to Denmark, you've got Thai, they're using their beechwood. We've got Manuka smoke over in Thompson Distillery, cherry wood. So if you get a chance, head over to the Discus stand in the main area. You've got Sonoma Distillery, and it's just fantastic to understand that you use what is available to you, and because of that you're starting to get different flavours. So breaking down what smoke is and what smoke can be is just another way of how whiskey is starting to divide itself up and show the consumer, show the people drinking the product, that whiskey is not this black and white that we may have already kind of the box that we've seen. The whiskey box is growing, and there are lots of players inside from a world whiskey perspective that are only growing and growing and growing as more people take note. So as I finish off today, the one thing I would recommend is please just go and find a distillery that you've never heard of in a country that you didn't think was producing whiskey, and try something, because I assure you you'll be pleasantly surprised. That's everything from me. Thank you.
Oh, you're lucky you woke up, Johan. I was going to yell at you. Like, Johan, are you sleeping?
No.
No. Okay, good. Just checking. All right. Hi, everybody. How is it? You good? Good. This is a picture of me. The end. So what I wanted to do is kind of elaborate on what Fab was talking about, and I guess use a little bit of our own personal experience from the Teeling Whiskey Company. So Teeling Whiskey was established in 2012, but the family have been distilling in Ireland since the 1980s. So a little bit of heritage and provenance history, but I guess looking at it from the perspective of a newcomer to the category. So I want to create a whiskey. We talked about world whiskey. We talked about this geographically unique category that's growing worldwide with different countries creating different whiskeys with different regulations and rules. We're only just scratching the surface on the future of whiskey. But when it comes to Irish whiskey, and I'll talk a little bit about it, there's a big category there. It's one of the fastest growing spirits categories in the world right now, but right now it's a bit of a dominated category. So I wanted to kind of focus on positioning more than anything. So how we went about positioning. So first and foremost, like I said, Irish whiskey is one of the fastest growing spirits categories. There's so much interest in Irish whiskey. It's very, very rapidly growing, and I think it's two sides of the coin. One is what Fab talked about, this modern consumer. Now, excuse me, I'm going to swear here, but in some marketing circles, the modern consumer is referred to as the educated prosumer. It's a terrible term. But like Fab said, it is that very, very interested, much less brand loyal whiskey consumer. And a lot of them are coming to Irish whiskey for two reasons. One, the provenance and history and stories. Hundreds of years of provenance in Irish whiskey. When we think of whiskey, a lot of the time we're thinking of that. We're thinking of this romantic category where imbibing something that was laid down before we even existed. This idea that it comes from a generational experience. So that provenance, that history, Irish whiskey obviously has in spades. But we also fit into this new world of whiskey as well. This modern, looser classification around what can be whiskey from Ireland. So playing in both of these realms has been phenomenally successful for Irish whiskey, and that's firmly where Teeling see themselves. Specifically the US, like think of the US, like the prospect in the US is absolutely phenomenal. We were talking about this, Teresa, there, but yeah, premiumization of Irish whiskey in the United States is absolutely insane. Like, look at some of these stats, over 600% growth. Be that as it may, the best stat I can think of off the top of my head is Irish whiskey's projected to overtake Scotch sales in the United States by 2030. That's insane, considering that at one point in history, 40% of whiskey once came from Ireland. In the economic downturn, the first kind of golden era of Irish whiskey disappeared. That 40% just went straight to Scotland. And now Irish whiskey is slowly clawing that back over the last 5-10 years. To see the potential of Irish whiskey in the biggest market in the world is insane. And we're only just now scratching the surface. Like I said, you've got India and Africa and all these other countries really starting to be invested in Irish whiskey. But like I said, actually, sorry, I've got this slide. I forgot I summarized your whole deck into one slide. So I'm not even going to touch on it. But yeah, of course. The progressive whiskey drinker, like we said, that rediscovering Irish whiskey, much less brand loyal. If you think about it like this, my grandfather's era, I drink this brand because my pappy drank this brand, and that was, I guess, how whiskey was passed down. It was more like sports teams. I follow Arsenal because my father followed Arsenal, and I have these memories from when I was a child, although this analogy is dying really quickly on the vine. But the consumer 20 years ago was that brand loyal consumer. They stuck within a brand, and it's almost flipped on its head, like Fab was talking about, where it's a little bit more like music and the music scene. I guess you will have that friend that wants to introduce you to the new band. I was a fan of Nirvana before they were ever big. I saw them as a supporting act. You got to listen to this band. That's how people are approaching the whiskey industry. Oh, you've got to try this guy, this Storning from Denmark, or you've got to try Kiro from Finland, or Teeling from Ireland. It's introducing your friends, your whiskey club, your fellow bartenders to that new thing that they haven't experienced yet. Exactly why we're all here at BCB. So this is the modern Irish whiskey consumer. Like I said, Fab put it way better than I did, and I forgot this slide even existed. But in today's world, people still look at all Irish whiskey as one green brand. And that's our job as craft whiskey producers, to move away from that and showcase the length and breadth of Irish whiskey. Irish single malts, Irish pot stills, Irish grain whiskies. Not like Slag and Jameson at all, like huge respect to one of the biggest brands in the world. Not whiskey brands, one of the biggest brands in the world. They've done phenomenally successful things. But I guess what the issue was is a lot of people in Ireland stopped trying to innovate and started to copy the success that Jameson had. So that's where we found ourselves about 10, 15 years ago. So for us, it was about differentiation and finding that unique space in this fast-growing category. So looking at our branding and looking at this breakdown, we want to be unique to ourselves. Like looking at this, your provenance is a part of the package, which is part of the price, which is a part of your product. In that you have a product, but you can't then charge a price that's incongruous with your product. Like your packaging, for example. You take a screw top label in a pretty shitty plastic bottle, you can't then charge €100, 100 quid a bottle for it. So that's where we're kind of coming with looking at every aspect of what the brand is, the brand voice and the structure, so it all speaks with synchronicity rather than speaking to two different kind of segments of this new audience. But these are all relevant. Next up, we have our brand ethos. So authenticity, conviction, progress, and community. These have been significant for us because they reinforce our values. We can't just say we're a brand. What do? We sell whiskey. Why? We like to get people drunk. It doesn't really work. So our authenticity speaks to not only the whiskey and the character of the liquid, but also the character of our producers and our brand creators. And the conviction behind that is the proof. How do you prove that you are authentic in what you do and say? How do you progress the industry forward and innovate and move within that and work with fellow people within your industry, the community side of things, really. You know, the social sustainability side of things. How do you work with local partners to, again, progress not only the industry, the category, but your environment? For us, it's Dublin, and Dublin, we're creating Dublin whiskey, but it's also redeveloping the area in which we call home, the Dublin Liberties area, but working with our partners around us in collaboration. So all of these things kind of, again, reinforce those values in which we look toward ourselves. So a little bit of the brand story, a little bit about Teeling. So again, reinforcing what we've just gone through, taking the product in mind and the packaging and everything else. So we're reborn 2012. So like I said, the family have been distilling in Ireland since the 1980s, but we're reborn. We're confident to forge a new future for Irish whiskey, as opposed to, again, kind of taking inspiration from the past. We're respectful of the past, but we're confident to forge a new future. We're a contemporary, original vision for the future of the category. Again, promoting the future of the industry, as opposed to, I guess, hanging our hat on something that has been before. We are not caretakers of a brand that was established 200 years ago. We're establishing something today that will hopefully last 200 years into the future. But like I said, it's about being respectful of the past. So again, that authenticity of the area in which we come from. So not only have the immediate Teeling family, Jack and Stephen Teeling, been distilling in Ireland with their father since the 1980s, there are links as far back as the 1700s, the first golden era of Irish whiskey. And that Walter Teeling distillery, established in 1782, was 500 metres away from where we now call home. So again, that Dublin Reborn as part of our logo speaks to our home. It speaks to the Liberties area of Dublin, and that focus on the community in which we stand. When it comes to the liquids, liquid is key. You mentioned it very briefly there, flavour-focused whiskies. You need to stand out from the crowd, especially in Irish whiskey. As we see this next golden era, there's so much rapid development. We went from 2 distilleries in Ireland in 1976 to 4 in 1993 to 6 in 2015 when we built the Teeling distillery, to today there's 50. But with such rapid growth, a lot of whiskey distilleries are buying from the same source. So it's about that sense of uniqueness. It's about setting yourself apart from the competitors in the space. Else we run the risk of, like I said earlier, more whiskies being more similar than they were different as they copy the success of that leading brand we spoke about before. So some of the few things that we focus on as a brand and our whiskey specifically, 46% ABV. So as we know, 40% is the minimum set by taxation, not by flavour, but taxation. It sets us into the whiskey category, the spirits category. 40 and above is just spirits. But again, that number was plucked out of a hat, basically, and just essentially tax was associated to different brackets. We're seeing more and more craft spirits start to maneuver within that space because it allows things to do something like non-chill filtration, so the retention of natural fats. We know there's 2 big carriers of flavour in the world, alcohol and fat. If you've got a higher ABV and a higher fat content, it's easy to assume there might be more flavour in your whiskey. When it goes to the hand-selected batches, so small batches are the name of our flagship products. We know that doesn't really mean all that much. Just looking at the stand next to us here at BCB, there's Terramana small batch tequila, and we're making a small batch Irish whiskey. I don't think both have the same small batch in mind, but what it means to us is constantly remaking our whiskey. Because when we started creating small batch in 2012 and 2013, we'll happily put our hands up and say we weren't perfect at the whiskey making process. We had goals and aspirations, but consistently making that product means we get consistently better at making whiskey. You know, I always kind of liken it to cooking or creating cocktails. Johan, are you asleep?
Yes.
Okay. Like cooking or creating cocktails. The first time you make something, you follow a recipe or your mother's recipe, and it's fine. But the 100th time, the 1000th time you make something, you get nuanced at the spices in which you're at, and the ingredients, and everything that goes into that. The temperature at which you're cooking at, the length and time, and all of these things come with practice and repetition. And then finally, focusing on innovative techniques. I once did a seminar at Tales of the Cocktail, and I pulled a quote from a Scotch Whisky magazine that said, whiskey can be aged in many different types of wooden casks, from virgin American oak, ex-bourbon, sherry, port, or even rum. That's 5 different types of casks. Look at the amount of spirits out here. We're in 1 of 5 halls, and I would say easily 30% of these brands are using barrels in their maturation processes. There are more and more craft spirits and alcohols creating barrel-aged products that then can be used in Irish whiskey and a few of these modern New World whiskies. So we've got access to so many new casks. At Teeling, to give you an example, like I said, 5 different types of casks that can be used in Scotch whisky production, which has now changed obviously, and I'm taking the piss, we love the Scotch. But Teeling have used over 150 different types of casks nowadays. There's so many different wines and beers and spirits and cocktails that can be used to barrel age and then used to mature, finish, blend, vat your Irish whiskey. So it is very, very exciting, again, when we talk about scratching the surface of the future of whiskey production. I don't know what happened there, but I'll just keep going. There we go. Positioning. So we're getting to the end here. So when it comes to price positioning, so going back again historically, hi lads, going back again, looking at some of these brands down the bottom, like I said, the Irish whiskey categories was more similar than it was different. A lot of these brands were copying the success that Jameson had had. But I guess the problem was, though, is that some of these people are coming to Irish whiskey through Tullamore Dew, Bushmills, Jameson, Powers, Paddy, but then graduating to Scotch or bourbon because tastes evolve. And they were, you know, getting that $20, $30 bottle and then moving up, and there was historically nothing within that premium white space. So that was key for Teeling moving forward, because there was such a leap to your likes of Redbreast, Green Spot, and Middleton in years gone by, that everyone was just not going that through. They weren't graduating through the price brackets. They were going elsewhere and out of Irish whiskey. So filling that premium white space was super integral for us. And people start with Jameson and then find their way to Teeling through these other brands. The packaging, so again, you can start to see all these things tie into our brand ethos, our brand identity. So again, like I said, you can't have if you're going for that premium white space, you can't have a plastic bottle with a cheap screw top. It's incongruous with the presentation of your brand, the brand story, and all the things that make up who you are. So the traditional bottle, that is a dark green bottle. So it isn't a link to the past. It looks black, but it's a link back to the glass production methods in Irish whiskey all the way back in the 1800s. We didn't have coloured glass. So if you do hold the bottle up to the light, it's a dark green bottle. It's not the brilliant light green. It looks fantastic, but it's more traditional. The modern labelling, trying to strike out, so less family crests and stereotypical Irishness, and a little bit more modern whiskey. We like to say we're a modern whiskey that just happens to be from Ireland, as opposed to being defined by Irish whiskey. The premium cues, the cork seal, the embossing, shrimp wrap, all these things play into why you're paying that little bit more per bottle. It's hard to pay extra for feel and and taste and appear just similar to everything else on the market. So you have to put in these extra steps. The striking Phoenix, we need that striking logo that remains memorable. You know, again, people try it at BCB, they try a million different brands, they walk home and go, what was that one that I had that I really, really enjoyed? How was it memorable? How was it striking? Oh yeah, it's got the bird on the bottle. Or in our case, a phoenix rising from the ashes of an Irish pot still. And then just finally, to reinforce some of what I've said, to hopefully sinking home some of our achievements so far. Like I said, this was a story. I don't pretend to be brilliant at what I am. This is just the team in which I surround myself with, being quite lucky as a brand. And very fortunate to be at BCB for the last 7 years and have a lot of successes. But it goes without saying, we're one of the most leading progressive Irish whiskies in the world, with over 600 awards for our whiskies, winning world's best in 3 different categories, which is really important, and we're very proud to be able to say, because no whiskey company can say they've won world's best in 3 different categories. We're the only Irish whiskey to ever win world's best single malt, and then add to that world's best single grain and world's best pot still. It reinforces that we're doing something right by the innovation and the focus on this premium white space. We're exporting to over 80 markets internationally now, which is very, very exciting. I literally just came back from India, where there's a huge opportunity for modern whiskey today, with a dedicated whiskey consumer and so large a population. It is very, very exciting to see such an opportunity for Irish whiskey there. But not only Irish whiskey in India, but Nigeria as well. We've had phenomenal success in Nigeria, and hugely didn't expect that at all, and really, really interesting to see. So 80 markets now have allowed us to gain interest and investment from one of the biggest family-owned rum companies in the world, in Bacardi, to allow us to grow to that next level. Because it needs to be said, and this is something that's kind of important to me, is that the achievements and everything that we've just gone through in 80 markets for an international whiskey company with 600 awards are achieved by a staff of 20 people internationally. So that relationship with Bacardi is hugely important to us, because we've been stretched so thin as a brand for so many years, and we've put in so much blood, sweat and tears into this brand. So to see these achievements, it was always going to be a part of the presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Join us at the stand for a frozen Irish coffee and an Irish whiskey. Thanks very much for joining us. Hang around for the next presentation, and yeah, thanks guys.
Hi everyone. We're on the final straight now. I won't take up too much of your time. So my name's Steph. I've been working in the drinks industry for just over 10 years or so. I was originally living in London. I worked for Barry Brothers and Rudd for a few years, and then I worked for Moët Hennessy in the UK. And then I moved to Canada about 5 years ago. I worked for a company called Breakthrough Beverage. And then recently I joined Hoteling & Co., who I'm going to tell you a little bit about today. So I'm just going to take you through very briefly who Hoteling are as a company, touch briefly on the modern whiskey category and some of the things that we've seen been changing, touching briefly on some of the stuff that the guys have covered before me, and then really what I'm going to focus on are some of our key tips and key steps to being successful in this ever-evolving, ever-changing category. So Hoteling & Co., we're one of the leading importers of artisan spirits in the US. We have a very extensive portfolio. Some of the bigger brands that we work with are Luxardo, Hein Cognac. We have a very extensive whiskey portfolio as well. We import Nika, we import Cavallon, fantastic Taiwanese whiskey. We've also got some great Scotch and some great Irish whiskies as well. In addition, we also distill our own spirits, which is partly why I joined the company, to help set up our export business around the world. We started distilling in 1993. Back then the company was called Anchor Brewing and Distilling. We were founded by a gentleman called Fritz Maytag. He took over Anchor Brewing, who were a struggling brewery in San Francisco. He rejuvenated the brewery, got everything up and running again, and wanted to explore things in the distilling side of stuff. He wanted to bring back a traditional style of rye from pre-prohibition times. And so he brought back traditional pot distillation to the US, and at the time when we released Old Potrero in 1996, we were the very first fully pot distilled whiskey in the US. So we kind of started that craft movement in the US of craft spirits. I'll touch on that a little bit later and how the craft movement's evolved in the US over the last few years as well. So very briefly on how the category's changing. The guys have gone into lots of detail, so I won't dwell on this too much. But kind of broken it down into three key areas. So firstly, the expansion that we're seeing in different regions. And by that I mean regions that are new regions producing whiskey that you wouldn't traditionally think of. A lot of what we've talked about already, you know, things like Japan, Taiwan, but also what we're seeing in the Nordics and lots of other countries as well. But really that expansion that we're seeing of new whiskey drinking countries as well is super exciting, especially for me coming into this from an export perspective, looking at what we're exporting out of the US. There's lots of opportunities for us in all different markets around the world. Like Robert was saying, India, there's tons of other places in South America and lots of opportunity in Asia, with South Korea being a super key market where we've seen a real boom in whiskey over the last 5 years or so. We're also seeing a rise in craft production. It's been a little bit different in the US when we look at craft whiskey. We had a huge boom in craft whiskey in the US from around 2010 to 2019. And in the peak of that, around 2014, it was really quite taboo to be sourcing whiskey and not producing your own whiskey in your own distillery. And what that meant was we had a lot of distilleries that were producing whiskey, and it's very expensive to set up your own distillery and release your own whiskeys. So we found at that time we were having a lot of very, very young whiskies being released into the market at quite high prices. And very sadly, a lot of those brands didn't do very well and sadly phased out, and really allowed for quite a boom in the bourbon industry that we've seen over the last 5 years or so. But something that is kind of exciting that is coming out off the back of that struggle with some of the craft movement in the US is, you know, some of those brands died out, but a lot of that whiskey's still around. And what we're now seeing is some really cool brands coming out, some really cool ryes that are coming out, like 8 to 12-year-old ryes, and pretty unknown brands that are really bringing that craft movement in the US back to life again. So, you know, as different trends feed into different things, so, you know, there's lots of, it's evolving all the time, we're seeing different things happen. An evolution in production techniques. The guys have touched on a lot of this earlier. You know, we're seeing different cask finishes, different blends, brands being more open about what's in the bottle and what they're doing to release different things. Limited editions, and an evolution of sustainability practices as well. We're seeing this in lots of different industries. There's a huge demand there from the consumer to understand more about what brands are doing from a sustainability practice. You know, big focus on what brands are doing within the whiskey space in terms of water. There's a lot of waste products come from the whiskey making process, so a lot of brands really investing in water management and packaging as well, and lots of different cool eco packaging things. Looking to a company called Eco Spirits, who are doing some very cool things to support the on-trade and bring in sustainability practices there. So lots of different things going on. And a lot of this is all driven by the consumer, which the guys are talking about, a very different consumer today, and that's driving a lot of the innovation and the evolution that we're seeing in the industry itself. Growth in whiskey tourism is a huge thing. The picture on the right here is of Bardstown Bourbon Company. They are a company who we partner with. They make our bourbon for us, based in Kentucky. And as I touched on before, how it was quite unusual to be sourcing whiskey back in the mid-2010s. It was very taboo. Now that's almost totally flipped, and you know, companies like Bardstown wouldn't have been able to exist then. They set up in 2016, and they're now one of the top 5 whiskey producers in the US, and their specialty is contract distilling for other brands, and they currently have a 2-year waiting list for new brands. And that just shows you some of the other brands that are trying to get into this space and how there's lots of evolution there. So it's a super exciting time for whiskey. You know, as Fabrizio highlighted, the industry is set to grow to over 100 billion by 2030, and that's not that long off. So there's a lot more to come. So what I wanted to kind of touch on is from a bit about our experience as an importer and how we're using that experience to approach our export model, is how to try and not get too lost in this. There's more and more brands coming into the space, so how can you make sure that you're competitive in that space and how you survive and continue to grow? Some of these things are pretty obvious, but I feel like they can often be overlooked as brands try to chase volume. And some of these simple things are quite hard to claw back if you don't get it right in the first place. So it's super simple, and we've already talked about this, is really knowing your brand. What is your story? What makes you unique? Why would a customer want to seek out your brand, and when they find it, what's going to make them click through to find out more information, pick that bottle off the shelf? You know, what is it, if you don't have a celebrity-backed brand, which, we're seeing a lot of appetite for that, how can you stand out and be different? And what makes you fit in? Your vision, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to be the #1 whiskey in a specific category? If so, how are you going to achieve that? Who are your competitors? What are you going to do to beat them in that space and make sure that you're the brand that succeeds? What is your value? You know, how does your brand add value to a distributor? How do you add value to the consumer? What makes you different, and why are you going to sell over other brands? And these are just things that, as you start your journey into exporting your brand into new markets, searching for distributors, these are things that you should know and be really confident and strong in your vision with this. The second piece is around understanding the market. So where do you want to be? What markets are you targeting, and why are you targeting those regions? So really do your research. You know, as we touched on, there is hundreds of markets to enter now around the world in terms of whiskey. We're seeing new markets come through every year. But what is your business setup? How many people are you? You know, how much resource are you dedicated to export? From our perspective, I'm just one person managing our export globally, so the approach that we're taking is to open fewer markets more slowly, but really dedicate time to them, really invest in the markets that we open, be quite tactical about which markets we open over the next 5 years or so to then grow from there. What are some of the barriers to entry? You know, is it bottle size being the most simple thing? We're a US distiller, most of our products were in 750, so initially Europe was a no-go for us. So we've started that process of transitioning to 700 ml, but really understanding, you know, which markets is it a legality and which markets is it a preference. You know, we've found that now actually more markets are open to 700, and it's not just it's a preference. A lot of markets in Asia will take 700 or they'll take 750. So we're looking at, do we transition some of our brands fully over to 700 now, because the US will do both. So key things like this, especially as you're a small brand, it's expensive to do a lot of these things and set up a whole new production line for a different size. So really understanding some of those things. ABV is another key one. So in the US, we're seeing a lot of high demand for those higher proof whiskies. But that doesn't necessarily translate into every other market. You know, I'm sure a lot of whiskey lovers always lean towards those higher proof, that more purity of style of whiskey. But when you look at Australia as a market, the taxation's so high for those higher proofs that it can become quite cost prohibitive. So, you know, really understanding some of those things and figuring out, you know, do you need to do a specific export SKU where you'll proof things down, and does that still fit with the style of your whiskey and the ethos of your brand? So a few key considerations like that. Other typical barriers, labeling, always an issue. Try not to let it be an issue in the early days and get on top of things like that. In terms of market type, just understanding, you know, what drives the opportunity within the markets that you're looking at. In Europe, for example, are you looking at Spain, that's a more on-premise driven market, or France, where the opportunities are more in retail? So trying to understand things like that will help you to build out your channel strategy and how you approach different markets. Understanding your competitive set is key, and really broadening your competitive set, because what may be your competitors in your home market won't necessarily be your competitors in other markets around the world. So really broadening that and understanding what your key competitors are doing, how they're price positioned, so that you can really spend time focusing on what your price chain is. Because having to unravel pricing mistakes from the past to try and set it up better in the future is something you really don't want to have to be doing. So trying to get your pricing right from the beginning is super key, making sure you know where your guardrails are and having yourself set up for success. And a lot of all these things will be supported by having the right partner. And one of the first things to look at is the size of the distributor. And this depends on your vision, what you're looking to achieve as a brand. From our perspective as an example, as an importer in the States, we grew very quickly over the last 5-6 years or so. And we used to have a very fragmented distribution model in the States because we had much smaller brands. We were smaller in the beginning and we worked with various different distributors across different states in the US. Over the last kind of 2 years or so, we switched that model around and went national with a larger partner. Our business had grown a lot more and some of our smaller distributors were struggling to support our business at that time, and so we took that decision to move to a larger distributor. So it's something to consider. You know, as a small brand in particular, in the beginning, you want to be working with a distributor who can dedicate that time to you, who's, you know, you're not going to be lost in their portfolio, who can really help you grow. In terms of if it's a partnership, you know, do they align with your values, setting super clear expectations, you know, really growing that partnership together. Communication works both ways. And how will you support? You know, as the brand, what are you going to bring to the table? It's not just the distributor's responsibility to build your brand in their market. How are you going to support them? You know, how are you going to ensure that you're making things a success? So really just to sum up a couple of key takeaways. It's a super exciting time in the modern whiskey world. There's tons of opportunity, but it is becoming very crowded. So just a few things to consider just to make sure that your brand remains a success. Knowing your brand, knowing the story of your brand, something that we've all talked a little bit about today, is super key. Understanding the nuances of the markets that you want to go in to eliminate any barriers up front. Really spending time on understanding your pricing strategy, making sure that you're set up for success there, and finding the right partner who fits your vision at that time and can help you grow your business, and dedicating that time to building brand awareness, whether that's in the digital space, if you're able to do whiskey tourism, you know, if you have a distillery, things like that. Something that we did in the US with the brands that we import, we invested a lot in the key gatekeepers for us, the bartender community, so that's where we really focused to grow our brands there. So things like that to consider as you're setting things up. So come and stop by, come and taste. We've got whiskies and gin for you to taste, and there's some other fantastic whiskies over at the Discus stand in the hall over there, so come along and taste, and thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you to our speakers for doing such an amazing job. That about wraps it up, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask away while our speakers are still here. Thank you all so much.